Justice Robert Benham is a Cartersville native. He was born to Jesse Knox Benham and Clarence Benham. Graduated from Summerhill High School in 1963, Tuskegee University in 1967, the University of Georgia Lumpkin School of Law in 1970. Justice Benham served in the U.S. Army Reserve. He has served as a trial attorney for the Atlantic Legal Aid Society. He's been engaged in private practice here in Cartersville. In 1984, he was appointed to the Court of Appeals by Governor Joe Frank Harris. In 1989, he was appointed to the Supreme Court of Georgia by Governor Harris and won statewide election to a full term later in 1990, where he currently serves today. Judge Benham is married to Nell, and they have 2 sons. Please give a warm welcome to Justice Robert Benham.
There is some concern that the mic won't be loud enough in the second room. I think it's not quite loud enough. Okay.
Trey, thank you for that very generous, though undeserved, but much appreciated introduction. It's a rare pleasure and a real privilege for me to be here and to share this occasion with you and to see so many people that I have known over the years, some of whom I have talked to about the history of Bartow County and the surrounding counties. I do want to express my appreciation to my wife, Nell, who is here and has joined me, and I expressed some concern earlier, and I asked somebody if she was here, and they said, yes, she's here, and I said, that's strange. We've been married 40 years, and I couldn't feel her presence. And so maybe the age is taking its toll on me in a way that I'm unfamiliar with. But I appreciate the invitation when you've invited a member of the judiciary to come and share with you, and I hope if you are approached by any of the litigants who had cases before us today, that you could explain to them that it was because of my desire to be here on time today that since we were in session this morning at the Supreme Court, we disposed of about 100 cases in less than an hour. So I hope the quality of justice was not strained today, but we are one of the busiest Supreme Courts in the country, so it is not unusual for us to deal with a substantial number of cases in a short period of time. As a member of the Cartersville Bar Association, I want to thank you for inviting a member of the Cartersville Bar Association to come and talk with you. And I regret the fact that I never had an opportunity to try a case in this courthouse. I tried many cases in what we call the old courthouse on the hill, but unfortunately, when I came to practice in 1970, this courthouse was no longer in operation. I want to share with you just some brief thoughts today, taking in consideration and admonition my wife gave me earlier. I belong to some 8 to 10 different historical societies, and I'm forever talking about history, and my wife reminded me that I might have reached the age where I don't know the difference between appreciating history and living in the past. So I hope this afternoon I can express some appreciations about history rather than reminiscing about the past. No one told me what my time limitations were, but I'm going to have to go back to Atlanta this afternoon anyway to take care of some more legal matters. So I will try to work with alacrity and dispatch in dealing with some of the areas that are near and dear to me. Let me sort of set the tone for my brief remarks this afternoon. I'm a lover of poetry, and in fact at the Summerhill School where I attended a short time ago, poetry was important because it helped us understand life. So to provide the proper backdrop for my discussion of history, I want to sort of give you The Bridge Builder by Allen Drumgoole. This is an old man going along the way. Came in the evening cold and gray to a chasm vast and deep and wide, and he crossed it in the twilight dim, for the southern stream offered no fear for him. And when he reached safe the other side, he built a bridge to span the tide. Old man, said the fellow traveler near, you're wasting your time in building here. Your journey will end at the end of the day. You never again will pass this way. You've crossed a chasm vast and deep and wide. Why build you a bridge in the evening tide? The builder lifted his old gray head. He said, good friend, in the path I've come, he said, there followeth after me today a youth whose feet too must pass this way. This chasm which has been as naught to me may to a fair-haired youth a pitfall be. For he too must cross in the twilight dim. Good friend, I'm building this bridge for him. So let's talk about the bridge that history provides us, not only in appreciating the past, but learning lessons for the future. Well, how did it all start for me? When did I get bit by the history bug? I'd like to think it was listening to my mom talk about history and my grandmom. But I think it was more so when my mom told me to go see Miss Sally Ann, who was related to us. And I approached her. I was barely in my teens. That's been over 50 years ago. And she was sitting on the porch. And she says, Robert, what can I help you with? I said, I want to talk about history. And she says, well, I've just finished breakfast and I have some biscuits. Would you like some biscuits? And I said, well, no, I don't think I want any. And she says, you're just like an old uncle of mine, that he doesn't eat biscuits. And she said, let me tell you about him. So he was a young boy on the plantation doing slavery. And his mother lived in the big house, and he lived in the slave quarters. He very seldom saw his mom, but from time to time he would get an opportunity to see her. He didn't take meals with his mom because he ate out of a trough, like many of the animals did during that period of time. But one day his mom sent for him and wanted to talk to him. And he hurried to the big house. She met him at the kitchen door, and they sat on the porch. And his mom opened her apron, and she just had biscuits on top of biscuits in that apron. He'd never had a biscuit in his life. And she told him, eat all the biscuits that you want. And as he was eating, the overseer came out, shackled his mother's hands, shackled his mother's feet, put her on the back of the wagon, and rode off. And that little boy ran after the wagon, but he never saw his mother again. And Miss Sally Ann said, that uncle told her that he would never eat biscuits again, because if you ate biscuits, you lose your mother. Isn't it strange how history has such an impact, and how small incidents can have lasting impressions on us and forever bend the twig of our life and shape and mold our future? So let's talk a little about those things. And while we have such a rich history here in Bartow County, I want to spend most of my time talking about the businesses and tell you about businesses that were right here within 50 feet of where you sit. But let me put the perspective, shape the perspective for you. I want to talk about education, I want to talk about religion, I want to talk about political gains and businesses and military service and charitable organizations. But I'll have to admit that I can't cover it all here today because it took me almost 50 years to gather some of this information. Sometimes you might not think about just how much land that African Americans own here in Bartow County, and how big was the African American community. Well, to give you an example, half of the people in Bartow County in 1880 were African American. A substantial number of people according to the census. But not only did they represent a large portion of the population, they owned a substantial amount of land. And I want to take it a little by the communities. If you look, starting at Tennessee Highway, one African American, Levi Pruitt, owned over 500 acres in that area. And then if you want to go out to U Harley, one African American man who is a descendant, the Dorsey family is one of his descendants, owned close to 1,000 acres of land. And then we all know Miss Beasley, who is sitting here, of the Mission community, where her family owned over 100 acres, and I think still own 80 to 90 of those 100 acres or so. And yet in that same community there was Mr. Warren Glasper, who owned close to 400 acres, and Mr. Ed Hardy, from whom my dad bought some land, owned over 500 acres of land. The same thing was true with Emerson and other areas. Except Emerson, there were very few minority landowners because Emerson was an area that was mined considerably. So a lot of the land had mineral rights where you could not gain complete fee simple title to the property. But land was considered a source of wealth for people in the community. But there were not just landowners. There were craftsmen and women. And when you go to U Harley and you cross the bridge, the old covered bridge, that bridge was built by a former slave. W.W. King was his son, who actually finished the completion on that bridge. But Horus King was a bridge builder in the Southeast. He had been a former slave and gained his freedom from the Alabama legislature. And he was called by the citizens of U Harley to build that bridge because they had built 4 bridges in its place, and all of them had washed away, the last one washing away and killing the mayor of U Harley. And then they called Horus King in and his son, and they built that bridge over 140 years ago. And it is still standing, and it doesn't have one nail in it. It is completely built out of wood with wooden pegs. And I've had the pleasure of visiting many of his bridges throughout the state. If somebody says they want to go on a trip, I said, let's go to one of Horus King's bridges. And but that bridge is still here in Bartow County. But for the flavor of U Harley, I think you can't get it any better than thinking about some of the early pioneers, many of whom were African American, who cleared the land in the U-Harley community. And I talked to some descendants of their families, and they were just sort of giving me song and verse as if it happened yesterday. But they remembered their grandparents and their relatives who worked on it. In the U-Harley community, you had, of all things, syrup makers. Have you ever thought about that as a profession? There were syrup makers, and someone explained to me in great detail as to how you have the mule and you have the vines that you put in, the sugar cane to put in, and I had to make it my business to go and look at that. But the oldest African American church, which is near and dear to members of the community, is the St. James Church in the Cartersville community. It originally belonged to members of the white community, and when the war between the states occurred, then Sherman used that church as a hospital, and after that the church was given to the African American community. And it is still in existence, but I understand they no longer hold services in it. Also near to that church is the Noble Hill School, which is still in existence and is a museum. It was one of some 1,500 Rosenwald schools that were built throughout this country. And of the 1,500 that were built, 400 are still in existence. And there's the Rosenwald School Association that keeps account of who's where, when, and how. But let's talk about downtown Cartersville. Let's talk about what was in downtown Cartersville. There were over 30 African American businesses in downtown Cartersville, according to the census of 1870. There were craftsmen, there were blacksmiths, there were seamstresses, there were restaurants, and a host of other businesses in the downtown area. And the most prosperous African American at that time was J.T. Gassett, who owned and ran a grocery store that is still on Main Street. It is now the Coma Law Office. Sits right in the middle of the Main Street, and it's a 2-story building. And that was J.T. Gassett's grocery store, which he operated from the 1870s to the 1920s when he died later in that year. But there were numerous businesses in downtown, so let me sort of walk through them with you, just where we're sitting now. And this was known as the Church Street area. Of course, there was no bridge during that time. This is one of the main areas for the African American businesses in Cartersville. So right within a stone's throw of here, we had Jack Knox's Cafe. That was my granddaddy. That was my great-granddaddy. Had a cafe right on this street. We had Ed Bell's Barbershop, Walter Fletcher's Shoe Shop, Hamburger Bill's Cafe, and some of you remember Hamburger Bill, who lived over on Curran Street. But he had a cafe here. Mac Thomas had a restaurant right here on this street in this area. Willie O'Neill, who was a fellow Tuskegee graduate, went through the program of tailoring at Tuskegee, had Willie O'Neill's tailoring shop right, I think about 3 doors down from this building, if I have the addresses correct. Also, Johnny Walker's Pressing Club was right here on this street. Charlie Ware's restaurant, Bob Scott, who was one of the best known butchers in town. Jack Kellogg had a taxi stand just right down the street. And Maggie Knight, who later came to own Knight's Funeral Home, had a restaurant here that usually served dinner during the week and on Sundays. Buddy Kincaid's restaurant was here. Pritchard Henderson's Cafe was here and later moved to the Somerset Hill area. Mrs. Childers and Leroy McAfee had a cafe here that later moved to Main Street and at one time was in the same building where J.Q. Gassett's grocery store was. And Ben Tompkins, who went down in history, and I'll talk about him just briefly in a moment, was a drayman. And those of you who don't know what a drayman is, that's a person who picks up packages that come to the railroad and carries them to people throughout the town. I remember Mr. Ben because he had a horse and a wagon that he used to carry things, and he lived across the street from my great-grandmama. So I remember him well. This was the first business district, and the last business in this area was the Cartersville Tailoring Shop that was owned by Sarah and Happy Younger. I remember him hemming a pair of pants for me when I came back from college one day, and he made an off-the-cuff remark that I didn't particularly like. He says, "You know what, Benham? You are as wide as you are long." And I said, "You just finish up my pants and get it."
The sad thing was, he knew what he was talking about.
Sometimes the truth hurts, you know.
The restaurants that you mentioned that were...
Now, how the mechanics occurred, I don't know. But I know that whites ate there on Sunday after church. Now, as to how it was divided up, and there were two eras here now that we must understand. There was a post-Civil War era where there was a view right after the Civil War that everything was going to be all right and everybody was going to be equal. When the federal troops occupied the town, such was the case. But at the end of the Reconstruction period, things then made a drastic turn to go back to a segregated society. A clear example of that, this gives me sort of a segue into the churches. If you look at the churches, the African American churches, none of them came into existence until the 1870s. Within a short period of time, after the federal troops withdrew, then segregation began to take its hold, a stranglehold on the community. Up until that time, blacks and whites worshiped in the same churches, except blacks sat in the balcony. If you look at some of the old churches in town, you can see where the balconies were removed. And most of the church records, old records, will also list the black members of those churches, especially the churches in New Harley, which also has a Native American and African American cemetery, and most of you are familiar with that. But it was only after the end of Reconstruction that the churches became segregated and changes, not for the better, began to take place. But then the second area of African American businesses was Haytown, which is where the Tribune News office is. That was the second area for black businesses. And in that area was a restaurant cafe by R.L. Maxwell. Miss Pearlie Lay, who taught me in the second grade, was an upholsterer. Mr. John Milner, who was one of the most prosperous African Americans in town, had a blacksmith shop there, along with Mr. Frank Irwin, who had a blacksmith shop, and Mr. Lige Henderson. I knew Mr. Lige Henderson during his productive years, but he had a blacksmith shop there. And also north on Tennessee Street was another business area that was known as Richmond where Will Sloan had a barbershop, Marion Long had a cafe, the Freeman family, who later left and went north, had a grocery store, and there were other businesses. Now, the main area of business, other than here and Church Street, was known as Blue Front, which is the same area where J.Q. Gassett had his grocery store. If you would start at Agan's Bakery and come down almost a block or so, and then that little driveway between Irish Dry Cleaner and that next building, that was known as Blue Front. And that was where most of the African American businesses were located. And it was also, I remember as a child, it was called Bullneck too. It was also called Bullneck. But now let's look at some of the businesses that were in that area. There was the Kenny's Cafe, there was Robert Grant's Barbershop, Tansy Early's Soda Fountain, because African Americans were the first to start making ice cream to sell commercially. So he sold ice cream. Alex Goodwin had a blacksmith shop there. Will Good, who's related to the Spencers here, had a blacksmith shop. Luther Sidney was a cobbler. Young Carey was a cobbler. They were so skilled at their profession that during the 1920s, Warm Springs commissioned them to make shoes for kids who contracted polio. And the first polio case in this county was Rudy Jones, who lived in the Mission community. Also in that area, Mr. J.C. McCorkle had a taxi stand. Leonard Towns and Nan Allen had a shoe shine parlor. Henrietta Lowe had a boarding house. Lon Scott was a tailor, and Half Kennedy had a barbershop. And on top of J.Q. Gassett's grocery store was Dr. Moore's medical office. Several years ago, they were cleaning out that building, and one of the members of the Aiken family called me and asked me to come down and look and see if I could tell them what some of these things were. Well, some of Dr. Moore's books were still up in that room, and a few of his instruments, including a bedpan. And so I got those and gave them, first I called his daughter who lived in New York and asked her if it would be all right, and I gave those to the Nova Hill Wheeler Foundation. But those were just some of the businesses. Now, a change occurred, as change does. There were 30 or 40 African American businesses in the downtown area. By 1940, there was only one left. What happened? Why did they all leave? As far as I can determine, it was the 1930s when there was a hanging in downtown Cartersville. It occurred and was the first time that troops were brought into Cartersville since the Civil War. After that hanging, the African American businesses either voluntarily left or were pushed out of the downtown area, leaving only one African American business right across the street from here, the Cartersville Tailoring Shop, operated by Happy and Sarah Younger, and that existed until the 1960s. So where did they go? They went to Summer Hill, which was called at one time Sumner's Hill. Mr. Sumner owned property on the hill, and people were saying that they were going to Sumner's Hill. And later on, you know how words get misplaced and changed? It became Summer Hill, but it was known then as Sumner's Hill. Vera Gaddis helped me trace down that history when she worked for the Cartersville Police Department. She and I scoured through records and came up with it. So the new businesses that emerged in the Summer Hill community. Dr. Moore moved to the Summer Hill area, and his office is still there. He then established the Negro Business League and held a national, statewide convention here in Cartersville, bringing business people from all over the state. And also, there was a place known as Slab Stadium. And if those of you who remember Slab Stadium, that's where baseball games were held, that's where fairs were held, that's where a lot of things were held in and around Slab Stadium. But right there in that area, you had Sam Radford's Cafe, the McAfee Cafe, Mattie Carnes' Cafe, B&H Cafe, and I like this one, the Dewdrop Inn. You had the Cornelius Stokely grocery store. You had Henry Carey's cab stands. You had Nathan's Cafe, Joe Long's Blue Room, Cleve Watley's grocery store, Odell Dial's Cafe, the Hilltop Cafe, Francis Conyers Cafeteria, who also had a cafeteria down here in this area under the bridge. You had Grant's Barbershop, Lord Mac Brown's, who were Viola's relatives, grocery store, Alex Milner's grocery store and Woodyard, Pritchard Henderson's restaurant, Mattie Thomas's dressmaking shop, Will Ellis's carpentry business, Caesar Emanuel's insurance agency. Let me stop to talk about insurance just for a brief moment. There were some 4 African American companies operating in Georgia at the time. Afro-American Insurance Company, Pilgrim's Life Insurance Company, North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company, and Atlanta Life. Atlanta Life. Well, how did these insurance companies spring up? They sprung up because insurance companies would not insure African Americans. They could not buy an insurance policy at any price, at any time, and in any way. So what filled the void? Now comes Mr. Ben Tompkins, who in 1890 established the Brotherhood Lodge. One of the reasons for the establishment of the Brotherhood Lodge was to see after the sick and the shut-in. And until they stopped collecting dues, I belonged to the junior chapter of the Brotherhood Lodge, and I paid my annual dues of $25 a year. I'm sorry, 25 cents a year. I like to think it was $25, but 25 cents a year you paid. And the Brotherhood Lodge was organized that to join, you also had to have a skill. You could help somebody plant or harvest their crop. You could be a seamstress. You could help dig a grave. You could help make a coffin. You could fix up a potion, something that would help people who were sick, and they went in teams of 2s. If you became sick, then 2 people came to your house to stay with you while you were sick. They washed your clothes, they made your meals, they took care of your health concerns, and they were all members of the Brotherhood Lodge. So the Brotherhood Lodge was involved with taking care of the sick and the shut-in. Then came Austin Benham in 1896, who established the Burial Lodge, which existed until recently up in the Summer Hill area at this intersection of Weichel and Bartow streets. That was the Brotherhood Lodge, that was the Burial Lodge that was incorporated, and one of its main goals was to provide for the burial of people who could not pay for their own funeral. And I've talked to several people whose main task was that of building coffins. And several deacons in my church participated in that burial lodge. It also became a meeting place for most of the activities in town. The list goes on ad infinitum, and I don't want to forget the surrounding areas. In Adairsville, we had some 10 to 12 African American businesses there. We had a picture show in a dance floor. Can you imagine that? In the 1920s, in the 1930s, a picture show in a dance floor, and it was operated for only 2 years. But I have talked to people who watch silent movies at that picture show in a dance floor. The restaurant was owned by it was called Aunt Tish's Restaurant, and it was there until 1924 when Victoria McDowell and her mother operated that restaurant, and William Ingram operated the grocery store. The most prosperous person in a dance floor of color was Mr. William Posey, who was a blacksmith, who had a blacksmith shop in downtown Adairsville. I never heard of Mr. Posey until I went to the cemetery, and his monument is the biggest monument in the cemetery up there. So I made it my business to find out who this man was in the black cemetery with a big monument. And that was William Posey, who was one of the most prosperous people in the Adairsville community. But he was not the most well-known. The most well-known was Dr. J.B. Harris. He was well-known because he was a lieutenant colonel in World War I. There could not have been more than a handful of African-American colonels in World War I. But he was from Adairsville, and he went on to become the first president of the Atlanta Medical Association. And they still remember his contributions there in Atlanta to this day. Well, I've just scratched the surface in terms of the contributions of African Americans in Bartow County. I did not omit Kingston because Kingston had more free African Americans in its city than all of Bartow County during slavery. Kingston had 11 free African Americans, more than any other area in Cartersville. And Kingston was one of the first towns in this area to elect a person of color to its city council. I think it was Mr. Zachary, because I tried a case before them on the city council when I was a lawyer, and city councilmen tried cases as such. And I was hoping he would vote for me on the disposition of my case. That's another story for another time. But that's just a flavor of what happened, how it happened, and who was instrumental in bringing about change. I don't want to neglect the medical community because Cartersville had more than its share of African American doctors. The most well-known doctor was Dr. Moore, whose family lived in a house that my family later lived in on Canoodle Street before it was St. Francis Street. But we had an African American pharmacist here who had a pharmacy here on Bartow Street, not too far from Miss Beasley's home at the corner of Wyco and Bartow Street. But we also had Dr. Harris, who was in Adairsville, Dr. Weddington, who is still in life. Dr. Weddington came to Cartersville in the 1950s. He was my doctor after Dr. Moore. Dr. Weddington and I have kept up conversations for as long as I can remember. And he was head of the medical school in Akron, but he is now, I think, 98 or 99 years old. But his mind is just as clear, probably clearer than mine is at this point. But he was the first African American to be given privileges in Kennystone Hospital in Section G, which was the African American section in Kennystone Hospital. And he was the first African American to deliver babies at Kennystone Hospital. Prior to that time, many of the babies, African American babies, who were not delivered by Dr. Horton, were delivered by midwives. And I have a list of about 20 African American midwives who not only delivered African American babies, but also delivered white babies. They were the people that you would call if a baby was born. I was the first child in my family to be born in a hospital. It cost $28. And my daddy always complained that was such a waste, such a reckless waste of money to spend $28 when he could have had a midwife. But that is part of the flavor of what this community has contributed. It has not been a solo journey of African Americans alone. It has been a journey of cooperation between people in both races and all races. A lot of the progress we have enjoyed has come about because people realized they had more things in common than they had things which separated them. And if they worked on the things they had in common, the things which separated them will become less and less significant. If you want some more information about these different experiences over a period of time, I think the train is a good warning for me. I wrote an article for the Tribune News back in 1995 talking about charitable organizations. I wrote an article in 1998 talking about landowners and businesses, so there is some record of all of these contributions that existed over a period of time. Well, if I started with a poem, I would like to end with a poem as we go forward. When you look at history and look at the contributions that have been made, the sacrifices that have been made, the people who have died in wars and people who have suffered and labored to make sure that we have a quality of life for all of our citizens. I'll leave you with these words from an unknown poet. He says, "You are your country's keeper. Your government is but you. You are the woof of her fabric, whether she be strong or weak or true. Yes, you are your country's keeper, and yours forever the blame, whether she rises in her glory or withers in her shame. I have no doubt that through the contributions and participation of people here in Bartow County, we will continue to rise in our glory." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Got time for a couple questions?
Yes.
We have a few minutes for a couple questions. If you have a question for Justice Benham.
All right, let me start with Mr. Hill's daughter.
Do you intend to put all of this information together in a book?
Well, yes, I guess I could. I'm just still gathering the information. It's just such a pleasure to gather it. I've talked to hundreds of people over the years. I have sat with people who would take me back to their Native American heritage. I have talked to people on their deathbed. I had the occasion to walk down in a cave in Adairsville with an 89-year-old woman. She wasn't afraid, but I was holding on to her to be alive. But all of those experiences during this period of time, I've read old newspapers going back to the 1830s or so. I have fallen in more graves than many undertakers have put bodies in. My mother and I would spend Saturdays what she called walking the graves. And she would have me, as her sight was failing, she'd have me give her the name of the person on the tombstone. And she would start off her with this discussion, 6.4 ounces or 6.8 ounces. As a little girl, she went with her mother her grandmother, as a midwife, delivering the babies. And she carried a meat scale with her. And as a little girl, her task was to weigh the babies. And she remembered all those weights of babies over the years. So it's been a fun experience. I will write something at some point. But you know, when you start writing books, then you start nearing the end of your life, so I'm hesitating. In the back of the room, and I'm looking forward.
Do you have any personal anecdotes about Oscar Canty or his family in Cassville?
Well,
Could you repeat the question for our friends?
do I have any personal stories about Oscar Canty, who lived in the Cassville community? Unfortunately, Mr. Canty and I knew each other well over the years. We belonged to the New Frontiers together, but I was so much his junior in terms of age, you could not have jokes about people older than you. And so I know some, but I cannot share them because it would mean that I didn't have the due deference I should have had at a young age when we knew each other. All right, now, right here, and then I'm coming.
Getting back to the birth ordeals, do you know the last active midwife in your list?
I'm sure I have it. I'm sure I have it. Of course, you know, we have had a resurgence of midwives now. We have had a resurgence. I think the oldest was Miss Knowles, who lived in the Emerson community. And Miss Candace Sweet, who died in the 1970s, was Carolyn's grandmama. Where's Carolyn? Yeah, it's Carolyn's grandmama. She also gave me assistance as a young child. I was stung by a bee, and they called Miss Candace Sweet to cure whatever I had. It was not a cure I welcomed.
You're here.
I'm here. And no worse for wear. But I remember her taking a plug of tobacco, putting it in her mouth, chewing it, and slapping it on my forehead. And but she was a midwife during that period of time. But I do have a complete list of all of the midwives here in Bartow County. I have some of them listed here. And I do have it by cities and by areas, by Kingston or Dashville and all of this. Although I do not have a list of all of the babies they delivered. My great-grandmother did have such a list, and I have been in search of that list for a number of years, but she kept it in her little bag that she used. All right.
The Lieutenant Colonel from Dazzle, I would think that he would be related to the Harris.
Oh, yes, he's
Related to my mother.
he's related to the Harrises.
And secondly, you mentioned a guy named Austin Benham. Did you name your son?
That's exactly who I named my son after.
What was his profession?
He was a brick mason. It is my understanding that he played a major role in building a lot of the buildings downtown because he was a very accomplished brick mason. But he began the burial lodge that was located there on Bartow Street, and I think I have a picture of it right here, back into the 1960s or so.
Related to you?
What's that?
Related to you?
He was related to me in that we were owned by the same family. And of course, during that period of time, the ex-slaves took the names of some of them did. But that was the burial lodge that was here. It was a 2-story building, and many of the groups like the Masonic Lodge, the Knights of Pythias, the Herrings of Jericho, the Odd Fellows had a building in Kingston, and many of those organizations met there. Right down the street from that, up Tumbling Street, was the Good Samaritan Lodge, which was on the side of that hill, which was 2 stories high, too. That building burned, I think, shortly after the turn of the century. But the Knights of Pythias building still exists in a Daresville. I happened to stumble on it while traveling through a Daresville. I saw a man who had a 2-story garage. And I says, I don't think they built 2-story garages back there. That, it is on the Pullum property. That was the Knights of Pythia's building in a Daresville. And of course, those of you who belong to lodges know that you have to have 2 stories because upstairs is where you have your ceremonies and such. But that, it is a garage now, and it has imitation brick siding on it. But I have been to a lot of the old lodges, gone through the books to look at them, gone to churches and look at the records. So a lot of this stuff is complete because it has names, dates of birth, when they became members of the lodge, and what ceremonies the lodge had. I think there was one more question somewhere if I missed it. So Louise.
Have you traced your roots, and if so, where did your family, the Benhams, originate?
Well, I traced them all the way back to the water's edge, but I have not gone across the ocean. I'm going to send a saliva sample to find out exactly where it was. Because that can be done rather easily now. It can be done because many of the tribes in Africa are still intact, and they've taken samples in Africa of the various tribes, so it won't be that hard to get across the water. But my family on my mom's side came from, I think they were sold as slaves in Charleston, South Carolina, but they came from Plum Branch, South Carolina. My dad's family came from Lawrence, South Carolina, which is between the Broad and the Saluda River. What I thought was very interesting, where my dad's family lived as slaves and where my mom's family lived as slaves was only about 15 miles apart on different sides of the river. They never knew of the existence of each other during that period of time. But I can trace it all the way back to the Benham plantation where there were 56 slaves released from slavery, one of whom was my great granddad. The Benham family, it's now the Smith family, called me and says, we think you'd like to have this information. And I went up. What's that?
What year was
At the end of the Civil War. All of them actually were not released here because as Sherman's army approached, they fled to South Georgia near Thomasville. And so there are still some of my relatives living in that area. And I've gone down there to have a get-together with them. They spell their name a little different, but we traced them down anyway. Kathy Freeman, who is a cousin of mine, helped with that. But there were 56 slaves released from the Benham family. Willis Benham, and then his brother W.I. Benham, who was a doctor here, who lived in the Stylesboro area. I think he had about 26 slaves as such. But we have all of the names. The families helped me put all of them together. I was trying to look at old plantation records to see what they did. The Benhams initially were involved in raising horses because Colonel Willis Benham, and by the way, the Colonel Benham, who actually owned my family, was in fact a lawyer too. So it's just interesting. It's interesting history as you go over the years. And Cartersville has produced, I think, about 7 African-American lawyers, one of whom is Carolyn's daughter, Misty. I remember talking to her as a little girl about wanting to be a lawyer. So it's been an interesting history. And this, of all the places to live, I don't think I would want to live anywhere other than Cartersville. I've been on the court 28 years, and people ask me when I'm going to move to Atlanta, and I says, never. I see my wife smiling. I don't know what she concurs in that decision. But this has been a wonderful community to live in. People who have shown a spirit of cooperation and a willingness to work on any and all kinds of problems. And at one time, Bartow County had more African American elected and appointed officials than all of Northwest Georgia. And that speaks very well of us as a community. Well, thank you for the opportunity. I've had a fun time.